I used to believe humiliation only belonged to dramatic movies, the kind where characters cry under rain while music explains everything. Real life felt quieter, kinder, and less theatrical. Then my family invited me to a holiday dinner and corrected that illusion with careless smiles. The table was crowded with plates, jokes, and opinions that traveled faster than respect. Someone mentioned my cleaning job, and the room reacted like it had been waiting for permission to laugh. They called me their maid, not with anger, but with comfort, as if the label was already accepted. I tried to explain my plans, my ideas, my future, but my words landed softly and disappeared. I smiled because arguing felt heavier than swallowing. Inside, something folded neatly and quietly. I remember the smell of food mixing with embarrassment. I remember how my hands stayed calm while my chest tightened. I remember realizing that dignity could be taken without being touched. They moved on to another topic, satisfied, while I stayed in that moment alone. I nodded, thanked them, and pretended it did not matter. But it mattered in a way that did not need witnesses. It mattered in a way that rewrote something inside me. I walked home with burning cheeks and a strangely clear mind. The night air felt honest. My steps sounded louder than my thoughts. I replayed every sentence, not to punish myself, but to understand distance. I realized how small I had allowed my own voice to become. I realized how often I had mistaken patience for permission. I did not cry. I did not shout. I just kept walking, letting the city listen. When I reached my room, I sat on the edge of my bed and opened a notebook I had almost forgotten. I wrote a list of skills I had collected without celebrating. I wrote names of people who had quietly supported me. I wrote habits I had built while nobody was watching. I wrote advantages I had ignored because they were not loud. Each word felt like a step back into myself. I was not broken. I was simply underestimated, including by me. I remembered every insult, not to hate them, but to measure my future distance. I promised myself I would never beg for respect again. I would let respect find me when it was ready. I decided I would build something they could never rewrite. Not a story. Not a rumor. Something solid. Something undeniable. Something that could speak when I chose silence. I opened my phone and searched for opportunities instead of comfort. I studied hospitality because service had taught me human behavior better than any classroom. I learned how people valued experiences more than words. I learned how places could carry identity. I began saving aggressively, even when it hurt. I accepted extra shifts. I traded comfort for clarity. I stopped announcing plans and started executing silently. My calendar changed before my life did. Friends asked why I was quieter. I told them I was listening. Coworkers asked why I looked tired. I told them I was learning. Nobody knew that my identity was changing before my bank account did. Nobody knew that every tired night was building a different morning. I did not want revenge. I wanted proof. Proof that I could respect myself without permission. Proof that effort could outgrow labels. Some nights I still felt small. Some mornings I still felt unsure. But I no longer felt lost. I felt directed. I felt aligned. I felt patient in a way that surprised me. I realized silence could be strategic. I realized humility could be temporary. I realized dignity could be practiced. I closed my notebook and looked at the ceiling, breathing slowly. I promised myself I would not become bitter. I promised myself I would become better. I promised myself I would remember this moment without letting it own me. I knew the path would be long. I knew the work would be heavy. But I also knew something important. I knew exactly where my proof would eventually appear. And I was already walking toward it. I just didn't know how close it really was, then. I grew up learning to stay invisible, because noise attracted judgment in our crowded house. Every room felt full of opinions, and every opinion felt heavier than my voice. My cousins chased applause, while I chased stability and quiet improvement. They wanted attention. I wanted peace. They wanted reactions. I wanted results. I cleaned, cooked, studied, and listened, believing effort would eventually be recognized. Instead, labels stuck to me like permanent ink. They called me practical, boring, and useful only for chores. I accepted those words without understanding their cost. I told myself they were harmless. I told myself they were jokes. I told myself patience was strength. But patience without boundaries slowly becomes permission. I carried those labels like borrowed clothing, uncomfortable yet familiar. I did not know how to remove them without removing myself. Outside our home, I worked in hospitality, where invisibility was not an option. Guests wanted warmth, clarity, and care. I watched how small gestures created trust. I watched how tone changed outcomes. I watched how attention could make people feel important. I absorbed every interaction like a lesson. Inside, I still felt replaceable and small, but I began noticing something new. I was good at understanding people. I started keeping notes about service, leadership, and emotional intelligence. Notebooks became my quiet teachers. I wrote about empathy, timing, and responsibility. I watched managers turn chaos into comfort with simple decisions. I saw how respect did not demand applause. It simply existed when practiced daily. I realized dignity was not requested. It was demonstrated consistently. At family gatherings, I stayed polite and quiet. At work, I stayed curious and observant. I learned how different environments created different versions of me. I learned how identity could expand when nobody limited it. I promised myself I would stop explaining my worth to anyone. I would show it through results alone. Not tomorrow. Not someday. Slowly, steadily, starting now. Some nights I doubted myself. Some mornings I felt brave for no clear reason. Growth did not arrive as confidence. It arrived as consistency. I practiced showing up when I wanted to hide. I practiced learning when I wanted to rest. I practiced patience without shrinking. I practiced ambition without noise. I began to understand that being invisible had taught me to observe. Being underestimated had taught me to prepare. Being ignored had taught me to listen. I was no longer angry about it. I was grateful for the training. I was grateful for the quiet discipline it created inside me. Then an unexpected opportunity quietly entered my life. It did not announce itself. It did not feel safe. It felt fragile and powerful at the same time. It arrived wearing the face of risk and responsibility. I stood at the edge of a decision I had never imagined making before. I realized that everything I had learned in silence was about to be tested. And I did not yet know if I was ready. But I was about to find out. Pause. I told nobody about the opportunity at first. I carried it like a secret mirror, reflecting both fear and possibility. I imagined failure, then imagined growth. I imagined returning to comfort, then imagined stepping beyond it. Every image felt heavier than the last. I understood that invisible people are often trusted with invisible chances. I understood that risk chooses the quiet because the quiet pay attention. I revisited my notes, reading my own handwriting like advice from another version of myself. I remembered every moment I had felt overlooked. I remembered every moment I had felt capable. Those memories finally agreed with each other. I was not behind. I was preparing. I took a slow breath and promised myself something simple. I would treat this opportunity with respect, not desperation. I would not rush it. I would not announce it. I would not decorate it with ego. I would protect it with patience. For the first time, my past and future stood in the same room. And neither of them wanted me to stay invisible anymore. I stepped forward, even though my hands were still shaking. Beat. The moment felt small from the outside, but enormous inside me. I did not celebrate. I did not hesitate. I simply accepted that my story was changing direction. I could feel the invisible role loosening its grip. Something new was beginning, quietly, carefully, and without permission. And it would not wait for me forever. So I moved forward before fear could speak. I saved every tip I earned and ignored distractions that promised comfort without progress. Patience became my investment strategy. I stopped treating time like something to kill and started treating it like something to train. My phone turned into a quiet classroom. I filled it with articles about tourism, property, and customer psychology. I studied how people chose experiences over buildings, feelings over furniture. I noticed how places sold memories, not just nights. Reviews became my teachers. I read what people remembered, not what companies advertised. I learned that emotions stayed longer than checklists. Meanwhile, my family kept inviting me to gatherings. I went every time. Each visit made me feel smaller, but I showed up anyway. Pride would not feed my future. I listened to their complaints about resorts, service, and prices. I memorized every preference without writing anything down. I realized information was a currency nobody respected. People spent it carelessly, then wondered why they stayed poor. I stayed quiet. When a tiny partnership opportunity appeared, I did not react emotionally. I evaluated it calmly. I committed without announcing it. I learned that loud beginnings often end early. Silent starts survive longer. I worked 2 jobs, then 3. Exhaustion sharpened my focus instead of breaking it. I slept less, but I thought more clearly. I noticed how discipline changed my posture, my voice, and my confidence. I stopped chasing approval. I started chasing alignment. I paid attention to patterns. I observed how tourists behaved when they felt safe. I studied how prices affected trust. I learned why people forgave small mistakes when they felt respected. I learned why they never forgave arrogance. I learned how kindness worked better than discounts. I learned how silence often sold more than persuasion. I practiced listening. I practiced remembering. I practiced waiting. At family gatherings, I nodded instead of defending my plans. I smiled instead of explaining my goals. I accepted jokes instead of correcting assumptions. I let people underestimate me because it saved me energy. I learned that privacy protected momentum. I learned that mystery kept pressure away. I wrote notes at night. I erased doubts in the morning. I trained myself to enjoy preparation more than applause. I trained myself to love effort more than outcomes. I trained myself to trust slow progress. I trained myself to see setbacks as instructions. I trained myself to understand that nothing meaningful grows loudly at first. I began forgiving my past choices. I stopped arguing with old versions of myself. I thanked them for surviving. I thanked them for teaching me what not to repeat. I realized that every mistake had trained me for this quiet season. I was no longer desperate. I was deliberate. I started journaling about fear, not to escape it, but to understand it. I wrote about doubts, hopes, and quiet victories. I described moments nobody else noticed. I trained myself to see effort as evidence. I practiced patience. When results felt slow, I learned discipline was not punishment, it was protection. I allowed myself to dream without apologizing. I allowed myself to fail without quitting. I allowed myself to believe without proving anything. I reminded myself daily that preparation was a gift, not a burden. I thanked every quiet hour that shaped me. I trusted every small choice that protected me. I respected every slow step that guided me. I accepted that growth often hides before appearing. I decided to honor that truth with patience. I promised to stay present until results arrived. I believed my future was learning to recognize me. I waited without fear. I worked without noise. I moved without permission. I trusted my becoming even when nobody else could see it. I felt closer to change than ever before. I could sense it in my routines, in my choices, in my calm. I just did not know how close the moment really was. Pause. I kept preparing anyway. Because I understood that readiness often arrives before recognition. And recognition was finally moving toward me, whether I believed it or not. I did not look back. Not anymore. I only stepped forward. And the ground beneath me was already shifting. They invited me to plan the next family vacation, assuming I would follow orders. I agreed politely, because cooperation sometimes hides strategy. I collected budgets, dates, and expectations without offering opinions. I pretended I was still the same helpful background character. Inside, I compared numbers with my growing investment returns. I tested scenarios, calculated margins, and imagined ownership instead of participation. At night, I opened spreadsheets instead of social media. I lined up costs beside possibilities. I treated every number like a quiet clue. I asked myself what I could afford, what I could risk, and what I could protect. I felt nervous, but I felt focused. Fear no longer felt like a warning. It felt like a signal. I visited the resort website late at night, studying every picture like a map. I zoomed into corners, counted rooms, and read between marketing words. I noticed which features were highlighted and which were hidden. I realized how vulnerable familiar places became when you understood their value. I saw opportunities disguised as decoration. During family calls, I stayed gentle and agreeable. I wrote their preferences in my head. I listened to what they loved and what they criticized. I realized my opportunity was not to impress my family, but to outgrow their perspective. I kept my tone small and my plans invisible. I let them believe I was simply helpful. I even asked for their suggestions, which made them feel powerful. That comfort gave me freedom. I understood how easily confidence creates blind spots. I did not judge them for it. I simply learned from it. My heart raced when I saw the final numbers align. I reread contracts slowly, respecting every word. I checked risks like a careful traveler checks weather. I reminded myself that patience had brought me here. I reminded myself that silence had protected me. I reminded myself that preparation had earned this moment. I signed a document that changed everything quietly. No celebration followed, only calm determination. I closed my laptop and sat in the dark, listening to my breathing. I felt heavier and lighter at the same time. I felt responsible. I felt ready. I did not call anyone. I did not announce anything. I let the decision settle into my body like a promise. I realized the story was about to shift that very night. I realized the person I had been was gently stepping aside for the person I was becoming. I slept little and dreamed deeply. I dreamed of hallways, light, and quiet success. I dreamed of voices softening when they realized I was no longer invisible. I dreamed of standing in my own shadow without fear. When I woke up, nothing looked different. Yet everything felt different. I brushed my teeth, made my bed, and walked outside like any other morning. Inside, I carried a secret heavier than any insult I had ever received. I moved through the day carefully. I answered messages simply. I returned calls politely. I listened more than I spoke. I protected my silence like a shield. I understood that my signature had already rewritten my future. I walked through my routine with a new awareness. Every sound felt sharper, every movement felt intentional. I noticed how people rushed without noticing their own direction. I noticed how often I had once done the same. I reminded myself that success was not about speed but about control. I promised to protect my decisions from unnecessary voices. I promised to honor the work that had carried me here. I promised to stay curious even when confidence arrived. I promised to stay kind even when power followed. I promised to stay disciplined when comfort tried to distract me. I promised to stay humble when recognition eventually appeared. I promised to remember the table where I was once laughed at. I promised to remember the notebook where I rewrote myself. I promised to remember the nights when doubt felt louder than hope. I promised to remember that preparation had saved me. I promised to remember that silence had strengthened me. I promised to remember that courage had started quietly. I promised to remember that growth had never asked for applause. I promised to remember that I had chosen this path alone. I promised to respect it forever. Even when fear returned sometimes again. I looked at my reflection and smiled without explaining why. I knew I had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. I knew I had chosen growth over comfort. I knew I had chosen truth over approval. And I knew the people who once defined me would soon need to recognize me. I was not ready for their reaction yet. But I was ready for mine. Because the hidden signature had already begun to speak. Myself why I started. I reminded myself who I was becoming. I felt gratitude replacing fear. I felt responsibility replacing doubt. I felt ready for outcomes I had once only imagined quietly. I understood that success was not loud arrival, but steady alignment between effort, purpose, and quiet courage inside me that refused to disappear ever again. I stopped comparing my path to anyone else. I honored my own pace. I honored my own process. I allowed mistakes to teach me without shaming me. I allowed wins to encourage me without distracting me. I learned how balance felt when I finally respected myself. I learned how peace felt when I stopped rushing it. I accepted that growth was happening even when excitement felt absent. I trusted that timing would reveal everything soon. I waited for the right moment to let reality speak for me without any explanations or apologies attached because truth never needs decoration from anyone. I noticed how my confidence no longer needed reassurance. I noticed how my fear no longer controlled decisions. I noticed how my past felt lighter when I respected it. I noticed how my future felt closer when I trusted it. I allowed myself to breathe without tension. I allowed myself to rest without guilt. I allowed myself to believe without proving anything. I waited quietly for the right moment to arrive naturally. I knew the moment was approaching because my heart felt steady instead of restless for the first time in years, and I trusted that signal deeply inside me. I looked at the sky one evening and smiled without knowing why. I felt closer to change than ever before. I felt stronger than I had ever admitted. I felt calm in ways I could not explain. I just knew something important was aligning quietly. I did not know how close the moment really was. I only knew I was ready to meet it honestly. And that readiness made everything feel possible again. I waited for the right moment to let reality speak for me, knowing it would change everything I once believed about myself without asking for permission ever. My family booked their annual vacation at the same resort, completely unaware of the change. I watched the reservation appear on my system with quiet disbelief. Their names looked ordinary, yet felt symbolic, like a sentence finally finishing itself. I stared at the screen longer than necessary, breathing slowly. This was not luck. This was alignment. I felt calm instead of excited, which surprised me more than anything else. I assigned them a beautiful suite, not out of kindness, but out of confidence. I wanted the truth to be undeniable. I instructed my team to treat them with perfect professionalism. No special favors. No hidden gestures. Just consistency. I reminded everyone that every guest deserved the same dignity. I planned to observe, not interfere. When they arrived, I stayed invisible. I watched from a distance, learning from their behavior. They complained about small things, praised larger ones, and never noticed me. I felt no anger, only clarity. I saw how people treated spaces they believed they did not own. I saw how entitlement changed posture and tone. I saw how gratitude appeared only when convenience failed. I wrote notes quietly. I noticed what made them comfortable. I noticed what made them impatient. I noticed what they remembered and what they ignored. I collected feedback, impressions, and emotional patterns. I treated their stay like a living lesson. I reminded myself that this moment was not about them. It was about me understanding who I had become. Their comfort confirmed my effort had worked. The staff moved confidently. The systems held. The atmosphere stayed calm. Nothing collapsed. Nothing rushed. Everything functioned the way I had imagined during silent nights. I realized proof was not loud. It was consistent. It was invisible until it was unavoidable. I watched my relatives walk through halls I had once only dreamed about owning. I watched them sit in spaces I had built with patience. I watched them speak about quality without knowing who had protected it. I felt no desire to interrupt. I felt no need to announce. I felt complete in my silence. Some part of me expected pain. Instead, I felt peace. I understood that dignity had finally caught up with me. I understood that effort had finally introduced itself to reality. I understood that survival had quietly transformed into stability. I prepared for the moment when invisibility would finally end. I knew it would not arrive with music or apology. I knew it would arrive softly, through recognition rather than confession. I practiced my tone in my head. I practiced my calm. I practiced my forgiveness without forcing it. I observed how my family treated the staff. I observed how they treated each other. I observed how they spoke about money, value, and privilege. I learned more about them in those few days than I had learned in years. I did not judge them. I simply understood them more clearly. I remembered the table where they once laughed at me. I remembered the notebook where I rewrote myself. I remembered the nights when I felt invisible. And now I stood inside a future I had built without witnesses. I realized I did not need to prove anything anymore. I only needed to remain honest. I only needed to remain kind. I only needed to remain steady. The rest would arrange itself. I walked through the lobby late at night, when everyone was asleep. I touched the desk gently. I thanked the walls quietly. I thanked the effort I had once doubted. I thanked the fear that had taught me discipline. I thanked the silence that had taught me patience. I realized that success did not erase my past. It completed it. I realized that proof did not humiliate others. It simply liberated me. I stood near a window and watched the lights outside. I felt my chest rise slowly. I felt ready for the truth to breathe in the open. I felt ready for invisibility to release me. I knew the next step would change every relationship I had. And I was no longer afraid of that. Because proof had already arrived. It was only waiting for its voice. I told myself I would not rush the reveal. I would let the moment find its own breath. I would let their comfort settle before introducing truth. I wanted their memory to be clean, not defensive. I wanted understanding, not shock. I reminded myself that timing was part of respect. I reminded myself that power could be gentle. I reminded myself that revenge was never my goal. Growth was. I watched them leave the restaurant smiling, unaware of the quiet lesson around them. I watched their footsteps disappear into hallways I once measured alone. I felt grateful instead of proud. I felt patient instead of urgent. I felt ready instead of restless. I knew the ending of this chapter would arrive soon, but I also knew it would not be loud. It would be honest. And honesty, I had learned, always speaks last. I waited calmly, knowing the next door would open itself. I expected confrontation, but I did not expect vulnerability. I had rehearsed every possible reaction in my head, imagining anger, confusion, and perhaps pride, but nothing prepared me for the quiet pause that came instead. I watched my relatives soften when they felt impressed, their usual confident posture giving way to something fragile, almost unsure. They praised the service, the rooms, and the atmosphere, unaware that the hands guiding their comfort belonged to me. I listened quietly from a distance, collecting courage, feeling the weight of all the years I had silently endured. When I finally introduced myself as the owner, their smiles froze politely, as if the ground had shifted beneath them. Silence felt heavier than any insult I had ever received, stretching longer than the jokes they used to throw at me. I explained my journey simply, without drama or blame. I wanted understanding, not victory. I wanted them to see me as I had seen myself for years, persistent, patient, capable. Some apologized quietly, some avoided eye contact, and some stayed defensive. I accepted every reaction without changing my tone. I realized closure did not require agreement. It required honesty, consistency, and the courage to stand unshaken in truth. I thanked them for supporting my growth, even unknowingly, because every experience had built the foundation that brought me here. That sentence, simple and unembellished, changed the room. Power shifted without shouting. Confidence replaced tension. Respect, once withheld, began to show itself naturally. I felt lighter than I had ever felt before. Years of quiet preparation, years of hidden effort, suddenly condensed into a moment that required nothing but presence. I saw myself clearly for the first time, not through their eyes, but through my own. Every label, every insult, every moment I had been underestimated dissolved into understanding. I realized that the past had not been wasted, it had been shaping this precise moment. And I understood why this moment mattered so very deeply. It was not just about ownership, or recognition, or even validation. It was about claiming my own narrative, standing in it fully, and finally allowing everyone, including myself, to see the result of persistence, patience, and unwavering focus. Pause. The room had changed, and so had I. The subtle shift of power was not loud, but it was undeniable. I felt a calm strength settle in my chest. I had waited years for this clarity, and now it was finally tangible. I looked around, noting the mix of emotions, admiration, surprise, even discomfort, and I smiled quietly. I did not need them to fully understand. I only needed to stand in my truth. I realized I could never return to being invisible again. I had been seen, fully and intentionally, and that was enough. I walked away from the table that night lighter, steadier, more certain than ever before. Every small decision I had made, every night I had spent learning, saving, and observing, had led me to this revelation. I felt free, not because of their recognition, but because I had proven to myself that I could rise above labels, above judgment, above expectation. And that freedom was mine forever. I left the conversation without demanding anything from them. No explanations. No justifications. No ultimatums. My boundary was calm, not aggressive. I walked away feeling lighter than I had in years. For the first time, I understood that my presence did not require permission, and my peace did not require approval. I returned to my routine with a stronger sense of direction, carrying confidence instead of defensiveness. I invested more into staff development and guest experience. I nurtured talent, encouraged ideas, and celebrated growth quietly. I turned the resort into a place of dignity, not just luxury. Every interaction reflected respect, every corner reflected intention. I began mentoring others who felt underestimated, quietly sharing lessons I had learned through hardship. Watching their progress felt like looking at a mirror of my past, at the person I had been, and the person I had become. I realized that success multiplies when shared. Recognition does not need to be hoarded. I stopped monitoring my family's opinions entirely. Their judgments no longer held weight over my choices. I focused on building a legacy instead of a reaction. Every decision became deliberate, every day purposeful. My nights became quieter, my mornings lighter. I felt proud without being loud, content without needing applause. I finally understood that survival was not about proving others wrong, but about proving myself capable. I could honor my journey without holding grudges. I could define my worth without seeking permission. I wrote a private letter to my younger self, promising protection, patience, and trust in the process. I reminded that small efforts accumulate into transformation, that discipline shapes character more than chance, and that every insult was temporary, but skill and integrity were permanent. Then, something unexpected interrupted my quiet progress suddenly. A call arrived late at night. It was brief. Its message was clear. My calm world shifted, but I was no longer unprepared. I breathed deeply, realizing that growth was continuous, and challenges would always arrive, but this time, I was ready to meet them on my own terms. My family started sharing my story with pride, rewriting it with softer details. The same relatives who once laughed at me now told tales of my success as if it had always been expected. I noticed how quickly embarrassment transformed into admiration, how the sharp edges of ridicule dulled into polite awe. I did not correct them. Truth no longer needed defense. It had arrived on its own, undeniable and complete. Their friends asked questions, curious about the person who had quietly built something extraordinary. My name traveled differently now, carrying weight I had earned silently. I watched from a distance, detached and curious. I realized karma was not loud punishment, but silent rearrangement. It was the natural order of effort, patience, and integrity finally meeting recognition. People began treating me with the respect they once delayed, speaking to me with care, listening without interruption, acknowledging contributions they had once overlooked. I felt no satisfaction in vengeance, only understanding of the quiet power of consistency. I continued improving the resort. Every decision prioritized sustainability, dignity, and growth. I expanded partnerships carefully, protecting my team and ensuring they felt valued. I refused to let bitterness touch my success. I reminded myself that every insult, every overlooked effort, and every quiet hardship had trained me for this very moment. I felt grateful for every difficult memory that shaped me, seeing the past not as trauma, but as training, preparation for a life I now fully owned. I forgave quietly, without announcing it. There was no need for statements or confrontations. Forgiveness was my own liberation, not a performance for anyone else. I finally understood what survival had prepared me for, not revenge, not validation, but the steady accumulation of skill, patience, and integrity. The proof had arrived. The consequences had already been delivered. The work was never over, but I knew how to face it with clarity and composure. I watched the quiet ripple of karma in motion, feeling the natural balance of effort meeting recognition. And I knew that the path I had walked, the invisible hours, the silent preparation, the patience, was not wasted. It had carried me here, and it would carry me further still. I faced my family one last time, not to argue, not to demand recognition, but to close the circle that had shaped so much of my life. I spoke calmly, with measured words and steady breaths. I thanked them for teaching me resilience, even though they had never intended to. I told them I hoped they found peace with their words, with the labels they had once thrown so carelessly. Some looked relieved, as if a weight they did not realize they carried had lifted. Others looked ashamed, the memory of their jokes meeting the quiet dignity I now embodied. A few looked inspired, quietly realizing that change is possible even in the most ordinary people. I accepted every reaction with equal calm. I realized that resolution was not a dramatic scene, filled with shouting or apologies. It was a quiet alignment, a recognition of the lessons learned, the mistakes endured, and the growth achieved. I felt no need to revisit the past again. I had already built a future strong enough to hold itself. I returned to my work with renewed clarity. I focused on sustainability, community, and mentorship. I measured success by impact, not applause. I celebrated the quiet victories, the small improvements, the staff who flourished because they had someone to guide them thoughtfully. I felt stronger because I no longer carried invisible chains, no longer sought validation in eyes that had once overlooked me. I understood now that dignity grows when you stop asking for permission, when you act in alignment with your values rather than the expectations of others. I promised myself I would protect this version of me. I promised to honor the years of preparation, the nights of study, the silent effort that had carried me here. I recognized how far I had traveled emotionally, how many small decisions had compounded into a life I was proud to lead. I closed the door without slamming it, leaving the past behind without resistance, without anger, without regret. Why? Because the strength I had built was not measured by confrontation or acknowledgement. It was measured by the calm certainty I carried inside, the clarity I now owned. The circle was complete, and I no longer needed to prove anything. I only needed to continue walking forward, steady, confident, and free. I learned that labels only survive when we carry them. I chose to put mine down gently and walk forward. I stopped measuring myself against old rooms, old jokes, old voices that had once felt louder than my own. I measured myself against the courage I practiced daily, the patience I nurtured in quiet nights, the small victories nobody witnessed. I realized survival was not about escaping pain, but transforming it into clarity, discipline, and purpose. Each setback had become a teacher, each insult a guidepost toward a stronger self. I understood that proof did not need witnesses to be real. My efforts, my growth, and my consistency were enough to validate me. I thanked my past for sharpening my future, for teaching me how to stand in my truth without apology, without aggression. I promised my present I would remain honest in all choices, intentional in every step. I promised my future I would remain brave, even when comfort whispered otherwise. I realized dignity was a decision repeated quietly, not a badge earned once and forgotten. I felt complete without being finished. I felt peaceful without being passive. I had learned that life's most meaningful victories come from alignment, not applause. I looked back once, not with anger, but with appreciation for the lessons that had been disguised as hardship. I looked forward with patience instead of pressure, knowing that growth unfolds in its own timing, and recognition, if it comes, is only a reflection of effort done consistently. I understood that karma was simply alignment with truth, not punishment, not drama, but the natural consequence of actions rooted in integrity. I realized that influence, respect, and legacy are born silently, cultivated through persistence and discipline rather than noise or retaliation. I asked myself one final question, hoping it would guide me gently in all the days ahead. Would you believe me now, really? I smiled quietly, knowing the answer lived not in their acknowledgement, but in the person I had become. I had carried my story to the end, transformed pain into proof, invisibility into presence, and doubt into clarity. And in that truth, I finally understood what it meant to be free, whole, and intentional with every step forward.